Good afternoon and welcome to this, the first in a series of webinars on identity by Condatis. This webinar will last for around 30 to 40 minutes and will be followed by a question and answer session, so should run for around an hour in total. My name is David Manning and I'm an architect at Condatis, and I'll be joined today by Dave Downs, one of our senior developers here. For context, Condatis is part of the SiteKit group and specialises in the design, development and delivery of identity and access management systems across a number of sectors, including healthcare, finance, enterprise and government. We are a Microsoft partner and we have a wealth of experience of implementing solutions on the Microsoft stack, though we've also recently been working in the decentralised and self-sovereign identity space. To that end, we'll be running two sets of interleaved webinars. This is the first in a series concentrating on the Microsoft Azure Active Directory B2C product, and in 2 weeks' time, we'll be presenting the first in a series covering decentralized identity and the potential for use of verifiable credentials. In each series, we'll present one webinar per month, building on the learnings from the previous ones to delve deeper into the subjects and to describe our experience and our expectations in each arena. So now, let me introduce Dave and we can get started on our introduction to AAD B2C.
Thanks. I'm Dave Downs, one of the senior developers here at Condatis, and I'm responsible for delivering a range of our solutions using Microsoft's B2C platform for identity and access management. Over the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to cover 3 main areas. What is identity management in the context of B2C? A bit about B2C itself and how B2C works in practice using something called custom policies. This webinar is intended really as an introduction, so no prior knowledge is needed, and in the upcoming webinars we'll take a bit of a deeper dive into each area, everything that we've introduced here, and we'll give you an idea of the power and the flexibility that B2C can offer. First, we're going to cover off some of the fundamental principles of identity management as they relate to B2C. So identity management in B2C is about providing a trusted source to capture, hold and distribute identity information. It's about making that information portable through federation, and because we have a centralized source of identity information, it also provides a single point through which the user can authenticate with an array of other systems. One of the primary principles of identity management is trust. The user trusts that their sensitive information is being handled securely, and in B2C, that's made easier through the centralized handling of that information. This makes it easy to control who has access to the identity information, and that can be both the systems that have access and the individuals that have access. One of the most basic examples of that in practice is a website that requires a user to sign in. So a user might visit a site. That site might be controlled using an identity management system. The site itself acts as a relying party, generating an authentication request to the identity management system, which acts as an identity provider. The identity provider handles the request. It provides an authentication journey for the user. It ensures that the relying party is allowed to access that user's information. It then returns a response, which confirms the user is allowed to access the relying party, and it provides any other information that's appropriate to the authentication request. In this scenario, each party has a trust relationship with the others. So the user trusts the relying party, the website, to request only the relevant data and to use the data only for the purpose required for their current transaction. The user also trusts the identity provider, the identity access management system, to assert accurate and relevant information back to the relying party. The relying party trusts the identity provider to perform suitable authentication to identify the user and to assert accurate and up-to-date information about that user. And finally, the identity provider trusts the relying party to treat the return data securely and to trust it only for the period that's defined in the return token. That communication between the identity provider and the relying party, the request and the response, is handled using federation. So when we're talking about federation, we're really talking about the secure communication of identity and access information between systems using standards. In the context of B2C, that generally means that we're using OpenID Connect and SAML protocols. We talked about the relying party making a request to the identity provider, but that identity provider can also trust another identity provider, setting up a chain of identity providers, each one making a request and receiving a response, and so essentially acting as a relying party in the chain. Based on the capabilities of each party, that chain can be used not just to authenticate the user using external systems, but also to bridge protocols. So here, the relying party could start by making an OpenID Connect request to B2C. B2C then federates off to an existing SAML system and processes the token that returns. B2C then returns an OpenID Connect token back to the relying party, thereby allowing the user to sign in from a system that only supports OpenID Connect to a system that only supports SAML, using B2C as a kind of bridge. One important concept here is that the identity providers are independent. An earlier link in the chain doesn't need to know about or explicitly trust later links. So, in our previous example, the relying party doesn't need to know about or trust the SAML identity provider, it trusts B2C. B2C trusts the SAML provider. So there we've talked a bit about the deeper communication between parties. What happens if you have multiple identity providers, multiple relying parties in a chain? But what we might also want to do is go wider. So our previous example has been about a single identity provider for authenticating a user with a single relying party. We can start to see more of the power of an identity management solution provided by B2C when there are multiple relying parties. That's how a lot of the Microsoft products work. You have a single identity that provides access and information to multiple different systems, for example, to Office, Azure, DevOps. Each relying party has its own logic for when authentication is required, but each makes its own call to the identity provider and gets its own response back. No relying party needs to know about or share a session with any of the others. Again, they're all independent of one another. As before, the process supports federation to another identity provider, but relying parties only know about and need to trust the identity provider that they interact with. Another benefit is that the identity provider can provide a single user session. So say the first relying party signs in, the identity provider prompts for the user sign-in details, maybe performs some federation. At that point, a user session begins on the identity provider and an authentication response is returned back to the relying party as normal. So exactly the same journey as we saw with just a single relying party. Future relying parties then still go out to the identity provider to authenticate the user, but because of the ongoing user session, there may be no prompt, no need for federation. And that could happen across multiple relying parties as long as the session is still active. Later, maybe once the user's signed out or the session's expired due to an activity, or maybe if they need some kind of elevation that prompts them to do the journey again, the whole authentication journey can be redone. So having gone through those principles in brief, talked about trust, talked about federation, talked a bit about single sign-on, what's B2C, how does it work, and how does it use them? So B2C provides an identity and access management system that primarily handles interactions between businesses and their customers. Customers can use their preferred accounts to authenticate, which could be social or enterprise accounts using federation, so Facebook, Google, Azure Active Directory, or they could authenticate using an account that's local to B2C. B2C is capable of supporting millions of users and billions of authentications per day, and it takes care of the scaling and the safety of the authentication platform, it takes care of monitoring, and it automatically handles threats like denial of service, password spray, and brute force attacks. Although it's similar to traditional Azure Active Directory B2B, B2C is different and it's got different use cases. B2B is more focused on the business-to-business interactions, with admins inviting users or whole tenants of users to have access to applications. It supports managing those users' details, rights, the roles directly in the Microsoft ecosystem using something like the Azure portal. As B2C is more focused on business-to-customer interactions, it provides a lot more scope for users performing self-service actions outside, but still powered by the Microsoft ecosystem. And it's important to note here that while we're talking about customers, that doesn't refer exclusively to users who pay for a service or transact with a business. It can be any user who needs access to a system. So it could be staff, it could be partners, or it could be actual customers. The important thing is that B2C provides those users with a way to authenticate and to manage their own data through the use of user flows and custom policies. User flows and custom policies are how you take control of B2C, how you define what journeys will be available to your users, whether that's a basic sign in, sign up, password reset, or even more niche journeys like rights elevation or protocol bridging between systems. User flows are easy to get started with. They can be set up and configured directly in the Azure portal, but they're predefined for common use cases, and so they can be quite restrictive. Here in the table, we can see that they support federation, but it's to a predefined set of providers and OpenID Connect providers, and they support standards for connecting to relying parties, but it's only the OAuth and the OpenID Connect standards. And the target audience is really anyone who needs standard sign-in, sign-up, user profile management flows, and anyone who's got limited customization requirements. Custom policies are more complex, but they're more flexible, and they've got support for different protocols, different logic, and external integrations. So again, in the table, we can see that they support federation out to any identity provider that supports one of those standards, OAuth, OpenID Connect, SAML2. They'll connect to any relying party that supports the same standards. And the target audiences are still people who want to do standard flows, but also people who want to do more custom flows like the rights elevation and protocol bridging. Anyone who has a relying party that supports SAML or wants to integrate with a SAML identity provider. Anyone who has external API integrations that they want to do. We're going to focus on what custom policies are, how they work, and ways that they can be used to create the custom journeys that you need. The first thing to know about custom policies is that they're defined by XML files and that they're hierarchical, so they're not just designed through the Azure portal. You typically start with a base policy, which contains definitions and components that apply to all of your other policies. We typically have base policies that contain common definitions and components that would apply across multiple projects. Next is usually an extension policy, which adds additional definitions and components. We typically use that for anything that's common still across all the policies, but that's project specific. Then we start to get into the more journey specific building blocks. So generally users need to sign in. So it's likely you're going to need a policy that defines the components necessary to authenticate the user. That might be data capture components, it might be validation components, or interactions with the B2C user directory. All the things that are specific to a sign-in. What it's important to know is that there's ultimately one policy per user journey. So if there's only one way to sign into your system, only one protocol it uses, then maybe you only need one sign-in policy. Often though, you'll have multiple systems, maybe some that support OpenID Connect, some that support SAML. Here we've added two more policies, both of which define a sign-in journey, but accepts requests and return responses using different protocols. The important thing is that each variation of a journey has its own policy. Other common policies you might want could be password reset and user profile management. Again, each of those could have their own variations for OpenID Connect and SAML. Now, journeys don't just have to vary by the protocol that they use. It might be that you need multiple policies per relying party. So maybe one policy for your admin users and one policy for your normal users. So then different kinds of users are going through different steps in their authentication journey. B2C tenants support multiple policies. So everything you see here, plus more to suit the needs of your system, not just the basic sign-in, password reset, user profile. Whatever you need a custom policy for, you can upload to your tenant. So how are custom policies structured? At a very high level, claims define the data that's captured, the data that's used in the journeys, and the data that's returned to the relying party. Claims transformations define the fine-grained interactions with claims. So that might be text comparisons, it might be formatting claims into blocks of JSON, it might be doing Boolean checks, figuring out a true or false value based on claim values. Claim providers define wider, more significant interactions with claims using technical profiles. So that covers things like capturing user information, performing multi-factor authentication, which systems B2C can federate to and how it federates to them, as well as API calls to external systems. And finally, user journeys, which bring all of that together into a set of steps that dictate how all of those components are used to allow the user to interact with the system. So let's run through how all of that fits together and gets executed. The B2C orchestration engine runs in the identity experience framework. It's what takes the custom policies that you upload and actually executes the steps that they define. So as mentioned earlier, your relying party requires a user to authenticate. The user accesses the relying party and is redirected to B2C with a request to authenticate using a particular policy. That policy might require some user input. That user input might need to do email validation. It might need to do multi-factor authentication to prove that the user either owns an email address or that the phone number that they've entered is valid. The policy probably interacts with the B2C user directory to read and write user details from AAD itself. Because that's AAD, it fully supports Graph API, so you can communicate with it using Microsoft Graph if you need to communicate externally to B2C. If you're performing a sign-in, then a token request will be made to the user directory by B2C to authenticate the user and to get some basic details. If you're doing an external sign-in, then B2C will federate to the external provider and consume the return token to again get some basic details about the user. So that might be where you're federating off to Facebook, Google, Azure AD if it's an external Active Directory. And then maybe you need to interact with external systems using REST APIs. So you might want to write some additional audit information. You might want to read user information from Dynamics 365 or create a new contact record in Salesforce. And that flow can be as complex as needed, and it can do multiple steps, utilizing different components in different orders, depending on the journey. Ultimately, once the journey is complete, a token is issued back to the relying party via the user's client, which the relying party consumes to confirm that the user's authenticated. So you've gone through the full journey of the user turning up at the relying party requesting authentication, B2C running some journey depending on the policy that's being executed, and then returning a token back to the relying party to say this is an authenticated user and they have these particular details associated with them. And that's how the components interact. So let's dive into a few just to see a bit more detail about some of the common functionality. So most commonly, what you're going to need to do is capture some kind of input from your user. Broadly in B2C, that's split into multiple parts. There's a self-assertion, which is what information you're capturing from the user. There's content definitions, which are how those capture screens are presented to the user, how they're laid out, how they're styled. And validation, which is what rules are being run to ensure that the captured data is correct. It supports custom HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So the content definitions can be completely styled to suit whatever branding is required for a particular journey. And basic validation can be built into the custom policies, both on individual claims, so maybe some fields are required, maybe some fields have a certain length, but also across multiple claims. So maybe for doing password comparisons when a user's entering the password twice during a reset or during registration. Any more complex validation It's also supported, but that's usually done through external API calls to REST APIs. So again, that might be validating that a user's allowed access to a system by looking up their rights in SQL Server or Dynamics 365, or even just running some custom logic that you can't quite fit into a policy. Federation, we've talked about a lot. So we've talked about identity providers providing federated authentication requests, trusting another identity provider to return user info. B2C supports using OAuth, OpenID Connect, and SAML to do that. It's got public examples for some of the common providers, but any system that supports those standards can be integrated. So we're seeing here, there's common examples for Azure Active Directory, Google, LinkedIn, Twitter, but we've also done recent integrations for things like NHS Login, which, although it's not in this list, uses OpenID Connect. So because it supports that standard, it just fits in, perfectly well. We've also mentioned integrating with external systems using API calls. So those can be used to read and write data, as well as to perform actions with systems outside of B2C. So for example, you might want to access additional user information from Dynamics 365, or to write new customer records into Dynamics 365 or into Salesforce. You might want to access role information that's stored in SQL Server, or write audit information to Cosmos DB or Service Bus or Event Hub. APIs are used to bridge external systems to B2C, which adds a lot of power to what can be done with user journeys. To make sure everything's secure, B2C supports providing authentication to those API calls. So that might be basic authentication, which is your old style username and password and a header, or it might be the more modern bearer tokens and client certificates, making sure that all the calls that B2C makes are completely secure with whatever API it's communicating with. So those are some of the common components. How are they actually used? User journeys are what tie everything together. They define how the steps combine, how the user should authenticate. They support complex logic through the use of orchestration steps, which are the order in which components should be executed, through conditional access, which is whether particular steps should be executed given the current state, all culminating in issuing a customized token that can be consumed by the relying party, and that token can contain information that's relevant to the user and to the systems that they're interacting with. You can have different journeys for different use cases, so sign in, sign up, maybe a combined sign in and sign up if you want to provide a login screen with the option for a user to register, or it could be something completely custom like rights elevation. Because they support different use cases and this conditional access, it allows you to do things like progressive profiling, which is capturing some information during registration and then additional information during later sign-ins. So you can provide a very low barrier to entry for your system, capturing the minimum information you require during registration. And then as you gain more confidence that the user is actually using and interacting with the system, then you start to prompt them for more profile information, which maybe feeds into business information systems. And really, in a nutshell, that's it. That's an overview of what B2C is and how you can start to use custom policies to provide meaningful, secure authentication journeys to customers. There's just one last thing to touch on that's not really part of B2C custom policies, but it is related, and that's migrating existing users into B2C. So it's a pretty common requirement, and the first, most obvious way is to do it in bulk ahead of the first user signing in. Typically that uses Graph API to directly write to the Active Directory. The downside there is the time it takes if there's a lot of users, but also handling things like password migration can be tricky. So chances are your existing system will hash the password so they can't be read by any staff members. They're secure if they leak. If that happens, it becomes quite awkward to migrate that into B2C. So the alternative is to do a just-in-time migration, which is really just additional steps in the custom policies, calling APIs to read user info from the old system and then write it into the Active Directory as part of the process. So that can be conditional. it can be done for a user who's not already migrated, so you're not constantly querying the old system for users that are already in the new system. And it can help with password migration. If there's a way to verify the password on the old system, so for example, if it supports OpenID Connect's RPC calls, then B2C's already captured the password from the user input, it verifies it with the API call, and then it saves that to the directory if the verification passes. So all of that ends up being transparent to the user. Or if you prefer, you can automatically enforce a password reset if there's no way to migrate the password. So when the user tries to sign in for the first time, the profile's already there, but it forced down a password reset journey rather than being prompted to enter their password. The downside to the just-in-time migration is that inactive users don't get migrated. Because it's running in the custom policies, it's only running for users who are going through the journey. So if a user never signs in again, they don't get migrated. Maybe not a downside, but something to be considered. And that's really it. So to summarize, custom policies define the sequence of steps appropriate to the user journey, including conditional steps to support different user types or authentication requirements and progressive profiling. It supports federation with external identity providers and integration with external systems for additional data capture or validation. The end result is a token in a format suitable for the calling applications. That could be SAML, OpenID Connect, JWT, with that token containing information about the user and also information that's relevant to authenticate the user for the relying party. You can have multiple policies to support different required business logic, all of which use a single credential, enabling single sign-on between different applications. Thanks for coming to the first B2C webinar. We've got more to come. Subsequent B2C webinars will take a deeper dive into the principles that we've covered at a very high level here. We've also got an SSI webinar series, which will introduce and then build on the concepts of decentralized and self-sovereign identity. Please get in touch to suggest areas where additional detail will be helpful. And with that, are there any questions?
Thanks, Dave. I think we'll all agree that was a comprehensive introduction to the B2C product and how it can be used. So I'm scanning the questions. I'll start with one of my own. Product support. B2C is a Microsoft product, so presumably they continue to develop it. Can you give any more information on the frequency of changes, the kind of things that they've been introducing recently?
Yep, so it's under active development. Microsoft have a public change log that kind of tracks all the features that they've released. Features generally go through a process of private preview, public preview, general availability, and we tend to be involved a lot in the public previewing and you know, trying features out as they get moved through the system. Some of the recent developments have been improved styling around one-time password or one-time passcode emails. So up until the last few months, the one-time passcode emails have been the fairly standard email issued by Active Directory. They now support fully styling those using like an external email provider like SendGrid. They're also starting to get into leveraging some of the power of Active Directory to do things like conditional access. So using machine learning and the power of Azure to determine whether a user is likely to be the user that they claim they are based on usage patterns. So, say where they're logging in from, when they logged in last, that kind of thing. And then if they're not coming up with a risk score and then maybe prompting for additional checks, so maybe doing MFA off the back of it or things like that, or actively denying them access to the system. Those things are still in public preview, but it's the kind of thing that they're working on, the kind of thing that they're moving towards.
Okay. And details of what's been published that's available on a log somewhere?
Yes, yeah, that's all on GitHub in a public changelog.
Okay. And actually, one of the questions relates, I think, to what you've just said. Can you trigger communication on the back of a user action, like sending a welcome email on registration?
Yep, so with custom policies, you can have custom steps that call REST APIs, which is what you'd really be talking about doing there. You'd probably use an external email provider. So like I mentioned before, with SendGrid, it'd be a SendGrid or similar system. And what you'd usually do is set up your template or templates in SendGrid, and then have B2C make a REST API call to that external provider to trigger that email.
Okay. All right. Another one that's come in. As an administrator for the system, can I manage my users' details? Because you talked about self-service.
Yep. So users get put into an Active Directory, so there's some degree of management allowed through the Azure portal of their, the public information like their full name and surname. Anything more extensive than that tends to be done with Graph API, usually with a custom portal if you want to be an admin managing your users, and then you get kind of the full control over it. But again, you can tie that back to tokens issued from the Active Directory, so you can completely secure it to make sure that only users who have the required access get to edit users or get to edit a particular group of users.
Okay. And you mentioned Dynamics 365, but presumably it could be any CRM. It's not tied to Microsoft products.
Yep. So anything that has an API that B2C can talk to, which is a pretty standard REST API, or anything that you can write an API bridge for, which I touched on briefly, but really that's where you leverage a lot of power. If you write an API to communicate with other APIs, then you can have B2C talk to that, and then that can talk to whatever. So like I say, it might talk to Salesforce, or it might talk to something that's without an API, so something like say Azure storage, table storage, or SQL Server. You could write an API around those and then pull in or write out information to those systems using your API from B2C.
Okay. Sounds like the message is B2C can handle pretty much any system where you either want to pull data in or write data out to, as long as you can interface to it using some kind of standard mechanism.
Yeah, which is, by and large, pretty much most things in the modern world nowadays, right? Most things either have a REST API that you can talk to, or they have some kind of library that you can use to interact with them, and then you can build a REST API around that.
Right. And it's all backed by Azure, so you get the scalability, you get the security, you get the continuous lifecycle development.
Yep, so you can stick it behind an app gateway, you can have Traffic Manager doing load balancing, you can secure it exactly as you would any other API.
Excellent. That's it. The only other question was about making the slides available. So this is going to be available. It's going to be posted on YouTube, so the slides will be accessible for you to look at after the fact. So that's it. That's all the questions we've got. Thanks all for attending. I hope you found the session useful and that you'll join us for the other webinars in the series. Final reminder that we'll be kicking off a series of webinars on decentralized and self-sovereign identity on Wednesday, the 21st of October. So we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for attending, and that's it. Bye.